In Islam, it is ultimately the knowledge of the oneness of God, combined with faith and total commitment to Him, that saves man. The text of the Quran is replete with verses inviting man to use his intellect, to ponder, to think and to know, for the goal of human life is to discover the truth, which is none other than worshipping God in His oneness. The Hadith is also full of references to the importance of knowledge. Sayings of the Prophet, such as "Seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave," and "Verily, the men of knowledge are the inheritors of the prophets," have echoed throughout the history of Islam and incited Muslims to seek knowledge wherever it might be found. Early Islam was dynamic. Its followers had the vitality of a people freed from a nomadic way of life. Muslim scholars were intensely curious about the world around them, and this helped to provide a strong motivation for the Muslims to come together with others in the pursuit of an Islamic science. They created an Islamic scientific tradition that generated an enthusiasm and dedication for knowledge unrivaled until the Renaissance period, many centuries later. For more than 30 years, George Saliba has written some of the most original and advanced studies of the history of the sciences in Arabic and English. After completing his education in Beirut and his PhD in Islamic Science from the United States in 1979, George Saliba joined the faculty at the Columbia University in New York City, where he became professor of Arabic and Islamic Science. The Saliba family traces its paternal lineage to Sparta, Greece, and is settled presently in what is present-day Lebanon. His family name Saliba is derived from Salib, the Arabic word for the cross, a reference to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. George Saliba joined us at the Wazir Khan Mosque, located inside the walled city of Lahore, near the Delhi Gate. Described as a mole on the cheek of Lahore, the mosque was built in 1634 by Nawab Wazir Khan in 7 years during the reign of Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan. Wazir Khan, whose real name was Ilmuddin Ansari, and after whom the city of Wazirabad is also named, was a friend and trusted ally of the Emperor Shah Jahan. Before becoming the Viceroy, Wazir Khan's real profession was that of a Hakim or doctor to the royal court, who after successfully treating Queen Noor Jahan, won accolades as a court physician and was appointed Grand Vizier to Emperor Shah Jahan. After becoming Grand Vizier, Ilmuddin Ansari became the builder of the best of all Lahore's architectural masterpieces that have stood through the vagaries of time till today. In today's episode, we will see how the Islamic civilization has been witness to a spectacular celebration of knowledge during the golden age of Islamic science. I've read in your book that there were some Arabic texts which are modeled after Persian for sure, but also Sanskrit. Now we're sitting in that part of the world where Sanskrit comes from, and this was part of northern India. In fact, the mosque was built by the vizier of North India. Was it the initial success of these interactions with other civilizations or languages that really charged up and powered that Arabic or Islamic Renaissance?
Let me make this very important point. I think it should be made with respect to what aspects of earlier civilizations became generative of new science within Islamic civilization. There are two main sources from which Islamic civilization incorporated science, again to repeat, to solve its own problem. One of those sources was the Sanskrit. The other was the Greek tradition. In the early period, say about the end of the 8th century, beginning of the 9th century, we have the historical sources and we have the scientific texts that tell us that many translations were done from the Sanskrit part, and for example, we know of the famous text that was called as Hind in Arabic, literally referring to the two districts that we are living in, the two regions we are living in them right now. And in those, they brought them in to make the basic astrological computations that are required in the daily life that they needed. However, there was a major distinction between what they encountered in the Sanskrit tradition and what they encountered in the Greek tradition. The Greek tradition came together with a philosophy, with an encompassing philosophy of Aristotle. So when they looked at astronomy, they looked at it as part of the cosmology that Aristotle described. They looked at medicine as part of the philosophy of medicine and the biological books that Aristotle described. They looked at mathematics as part of the examples that Aristotle gave. So in a sense, they saw that tradition embedded within a holistic kind of philosophical explanation that explains the whole cosmos around us. Greek tradition became much more attractive on account of that. What they brought from the Indian tradition and the Sanskrit tradition lacked that philosophical over-encompassing global interpretation of the world. So, yes, at the beginning there were some Sanskrit texts that came into Arabic, but then very quickly they were replaced by the Greek text.
As Islam spread northward into Syria, Egypt, and the Persian Empire, it came face to face with the sciences of antiquity, whose heritage had been preserved in centers which now became a part of the Islamic world. One such city was Alexandria, which had been a major center of the sciences and learning for centuries. The Greek learning cultivated in Alexandria was opposed by the Byzantines, who had burnt its library long before the advent of Islam. The tradition of Alexandrian learning did not die, however. It was transferred to Antioch and from there further east to such cities as Edessa by Eastern Christians, who stood in sharp opposition to Byzantium and wished to have their own independent centers of learning. What Saliba has done over the years is to outline the conventional accounts of Islamic science and then discuss their shortcomings, and finally, he proposes an alternate scientific narrative. To demonstrate this, he first proves the originality of Islamic scientific thought, and to do this he uses astronomy as a template for understanding the progress of science during the distinctive phases of the Islamic civilization. His analysis takes place against the backdrop of the broader question of what produces scientific activity in a society, what sustains it and enables it to flourish. I find it really interesting in terms of us, yourself referring to on the gates of civilization, where massive amounts of economic waste is happening. Maybe they don't have enough money to take care of those dwindling empires, and the Muslims looking at that in terms of areas to mesh with, or civilizations to mesh with in some ways. Would that be a fair sort of perception?
No, I don't think the matter was that much financial. I think the situation with the two other ancient civilizations I spoke about, the empires, say, of the Sasanian on one side and the Byzantine on the other, was also like all empires. They had already reached a stage where they no longer, or let us put it, they rarely fought directly. Yes. What they did, they always used proxies. For example, when we look at the Arabian tribes that lived in northern Arabia, the Ghassanis on one side were sub-agents of the Byzantines, and the Lakhmids on the other side, those are Arabian tribes. were sub-agents of the Sassanian, and they were the ones carrying their fights in proxy. So it is this exhaustion.
I'll give you an example. Like in the year 1347, the Mongol army besieged Kaffa in the Crimea, and they catapulted some dead bodies with the plague germ into the city. Now, city people didn't know what this was. They used basic technology incorporated into war machines called manjaniks or catapults. And what happened was a plague occurred, massive plague occurred in that city in Crimea, which was known as Black Death. Now, the impact of Black Death was profound in the rest of Europe. And as it spread out all over, as a result, there was scarce labor. People died massively. But another thing happened. Standards of living rose in the long term. Longer wage hours, higher wage rates. In fact, European society, it is said, moved from the medieval to the modern age because of some of those impacts that new technological innovation brought in through the use of science. Medical science has made rapid leaps into the Renaissance area, they say. And Black Death was part of the reason because they discarded outdated ideas and translated everything into local languages, therefore making knowledge readily available.
Black Death is a phenomenon that was not unique in that period too, by the way. When you read, for example, the works of Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, this is a 13th century Baghdadi author, of course, who visits Cairo at the time of tremendous famine and the tremendous plague. And actually, he also uses the plague. I'll give you an example of what he did, which corroborates slightly what you are saying, that sometimes calamities also help in a fashion.
That's actually my question. My question is two-pronged. It's one, firstly, does excess and its curtailment by natural causes, such as disease, environmental disaster, or war, is this necessary for bringing about change in a positive sense, or scientific production?
I don't think it's necessary at all. But if you are a wise person, you will make use of it if it happens to be there. I'll go back to Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi. This is a guy who travels to Cairo, finds himself in a plague, and then he tells us in his memoirs, which he kept memoirs of this trip, and he tells us that when he was teaching his students, he was teaching them medicine, he was handicapped, and he said, because no matter what you read in books, it is not really sufficient, and it doesn't really replace the ability to observe. So he says, it occurred to me, since there are bodies in the thousands of skeletons thrown outside the city of Cairo, that now is my golden opportunity to take my students out to those skeletons and actually give them their first introductions into anatomy so that they can see the actual skeletons right there. And what does he notice over there? He says, I noticed that the lower jawbone is not two pieces as the Greek father of medicine, Galen, had been instructing us. So he says, I began to doubt this. What do? I required my students divide themselves into two groups, and then I required the two groups to investigate of all the skeletons that are over there, how many of them are one jawbone, how many are two jawbone. He said, and both groups came to me and said, it was one jawbone. So he said, that already refutes the idea that I had inherited or learned from the Greek tradition. So see how this mind is working at a time of calamity, at a time of famine, at a time of plague and all of that. Then he says, I suspected, maybe because those dead bodies, their skeletons are still freshly dead, we can't see the suture here at the jawbone. Maybe we should look at all the skeletons just to see if this can be verified. He says, we went to the ancient Egyptian tombs, and we dug out some of the skeletons, and sure enough, they were still one jawbone. He said, at that time, I was sure that Galen was wrong. So you could see how a calamity and a famine, a disaster, helped, at least in the mind of Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, move science, move medicine, a step up to say Galen was wrong. Now we have eyewitness, we have double-checked it. He's almost practicing what we call nowadays modern science. He's using a control group. He says, yes, two of those students, each one is observing, and they're all on their own. So I don't buy the general theory that a plague is necessary to improve medical conditions, or that economic conditions or the quality of life will definitely improve.
And it doesn't matter if you're part of the dominant civilization or not. And is it necessary to rub or mesh with the dominant civilization to have a trickle down effect from there onto you? I mean, is there a need for a universal knowledge system?
No, then let me go back to the problem of Abdul Malik. You see, Abdul Malik had a concrete governance problem. He was not seeking science, but because of governance problems forced him to seek science. Then science begins to flourish because there is a need for its practice. You see, so in that way I can understand it. But look, the first world, the so-called industrialized world, since the early part of the 20th century, had already distinguished itself as something that is unsurpassable, and it is on daily contact with the third world, and they rub shoulders every day, and yet nothing passes, because the third world has not developed yet the mechanisms of being able to absorb whatever knowledge that can be absorbed.
So I understand that whatever the motifs or canons of different cultures or civilizations, there is still room for the development of different types of scientific production related to individualistic or cultural or industrial or linguistic conditions, for the better or the worse?
The governing principle in all of this, that there should be a need within society to require a problem to be solved. Once the solution of the problem is rewarded, you will find people who will strive to solve that problem. So wherever one should go, and these discussions, one should always try to dissect what problem was being formulated, who needs it to be solved, who is willing to pay to have that problem solved, and then you will find there will be lots of people who will be ready to cross borders, to cross cultures, to cross all sorts of things to help in the solution of the problem. And at the same time, civilizations will even seek solutions from cultures that are far away and they have nothing to do with them. Take the modern example also. During the Cold War, as soon as an article would be written in Russian, within 24 hours to 48 hours it would be translated into English. There were people who specialized in seeking whatever was in the other because there was a need to see what was the other side doing.
My fellow Americans, at 7 o'clock this
And
evening,
that need motivated this kind of work. You find the funding for it, you find the solution to that. So in that sense, I think that these examples are universal, meaning that civilizations produce their own sciences to answer to their own needs. And it is the formulation of the needs, of course, that depend on their political development, on their cultural development, on their own material conditions. All of those are components that one should pay attention to.
One of the Arabs' most valuable contributions was the preservation of Greek learning throughout the Middle Ages, and it is through their translations that much of what we know today about the Greeks became available.
And the Greek tradition survived to be in dialogue. It was never borrowed. It was always in dialogue, picked from it as needed, discarded as needed, until a whole new science was developed. And in fact, when we go on with the passage of time, by the 16th, 17th century, we know of Sanskrit texts that were translated from Arabic back to Sanskrit. We also know during the 13th and the 14th century that there were several developments in Islamic astronomy in particular that were translated back into Greek. So at the beginning there was an appropriation from those traditions. At the very beginning there was a payback. So we see it in both cases. But the distinction that should be emphasized, that the comprehensive explanation that the Greek philosophical tradition offered, and that was lacking in the Sanskrit, and that's why I think, in my view, that's why the Sanskrit tradition was easily superseded by the Greek very quickly.
George Saliba addresses the question of the origins of Islamic science and its developmental phase of subsequently enlarging the scope of Greek science, particularly astronomy. There were measurements, like you say that there's a half a degree of difference.
Yes.
And we find out that it turns out into a big flaw in terms of calculation. Now Ptolemy, the work that he did, and then the new measurements that took place in Baghdad,
Yes.
they were corrected. They were corrections.
No, let me articulate it differently. I think once they found that there were elementary mistakes in the Greek tradition, such as measurements, things that you can directly re-observe and directly correct. What that gave you was two results. First, you gained confidence that you can discover in a tradition that you are just trying to incorporate, you can discover mistakes in it, and hence you are capable of correcting these mistakes. So that, what is the first requirement of science, is to get that self-confidence, to trust your eyes, so to speak, to trust your judgment. The second, which is much, much more important, is that they began to question, why did the Greeks make the mistake in the first place?
Since Babylonian times, the astrological characteristics of all earthly experience and the fate of events was accepted as cyclic and harmonic, and the 2nd century Roman geocentric system of Ptolemy was modeled after the Babylonian system handed down through Eudoxus, Hipparchus, and Aristotle. To Aristotle, an analytical scientist, the sun represents the organizing principle of logic, still strongly connected with the image of Phoebus Apollo, the god of reason, racing his chariot across the sky each day.
And now they begin to discover that it was sometimes the instruments that the Greeks used were not good enough. Sometimes they discovered that the strategy of the observations were not good enough. In other words, that the Greek Ptolemaic text made observations at the wrong time. He should have strategically, to get the better results, the more accurate results, do them at another time. So now you can see how much confidence you are gaining. When you do all of that, then you can explain and begin to understand why they would dare to even go and ask the more fundamental question, is the very basis of Greek text, is how come that the Greek text seem to have contradictions between the cosmological presuppositions that they have inherited from Aristotle, and at the same time they can't represent them in straightforward mathematical representations that account for that cosmology. What does that generate? It generates for you new ways of thinking of planetary motion, of representation of planetary motions, forces you to develop new mathematics and so on. And this is the part that I talk about in this book, on how they were forced to develop mathematical theorems specifically to account better for the observations that the Aristotelian cosmology presupposed.
The famous Italian poet Dante described the subterranean regions of the Inferno, the various levels of hell, as a logical extension of Aristotle's celestial hierarchy. Dante's work illustrates the connection between the upper and the lower regions. It also speaks to the spatial connection between physical and theological realms. Dante's Inferno will recall that the subterranean regions, the concentric spheres, marked various levels of hell and various levels of sinfulness. The very center of the cosmos was the place of evil. The outer limits were pure and eternal, the domain of God, the unmoved mover. All spheres were hierarchically arranged. For Dante, Satan was at the center of the cosmos. God was at the outermost edge. For Dante, Satan, furthermore removed from God, resided in darkness up to his waist in ice. Like Thomas Aquinas, Dante helped baptize Aristotle. But in fact, pagan views were made Christian. Claudius Ptolemaeus lived in Alexandria in Egypt in the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era. He was descended from an Egyptian family and associated with the renowned library situated in the city. He is celebrated for his great work of astronomy known today as the Almagest, the very title of which is testament to its status and its tortuous history. The Almagest is a transliteration of the name given to the work when it was rendered into Arabic in the early Middle Ages. The Islamic scholars, aware of what they possessed, called it the greatest work, and the name stuck when it was later translated into Latin. Ptolemy himself, however, had used the more modest Greek title, Syntaxis, or System of Mathematics.
This is the part that I talk about in this book on how they were forced to develop mathematical theorems specifically to account better for the observations that the Aristotelian cosmology presupposed. See? So taking these together, you can see now why the encounter with the Greek tradition forced new observational astronomy, yes, new planetary theories, new mathematics, all because the Greek scientific texts were flawed. They had
Yes.
mistakes in them.
In astronomy, the Muslims integrated the scientific traditions of the Indians, the Persians, the ancient Near East, and especially the Greeks into a synthesis which began to chart a new chapter in the history of astronomy from the 8th century onwards. One important work that inspired the Muslims was the Almagest of Ptolemy, whose very name in English reveals the Arabic origin of its Latin translation. But Ptolemy's Almagest contained a fundamental error. Ptolemy believed that the earth was stationary and that the sun revolved around it. In order to make this observation fit this mistaken model, Ptolemy had to resort to ingenious and complicated calculations. His masterful inventiveness as a result produced a perfectly adequate explanation of observed planetary movement, even though the basic premise was entirely mistaken. Ptolemaic works, we see that there is some interaction, some inspiration, but come to the time of Ibn al-Haytham, the planetary findings and algebra and optics. Is there a payback attached to what the Muslims took from the Greeks?
These things should not be argued in the sense of who owes whom
Okay.
what. You needed a solution for a specific problem. You found that problem solved in the Greek tradition in error. You correct that error and you develop as a result a better science. That is as simple as that.
The Muslims preserved the Almagest as the Kitab al-Majisti, or the Great Book, while several astronomers of both the eastern and western lands of Islam thoroughly studied it and made a major critique of Ptolemy's planetary theory, especially Nasr ad-Din Tusi and his students in the 13th century. The Muslims also observed the heavens carefully and discovered many new stars. The book on stars of Abdurrahman al-Sufi was translated into Spanish by Alfonso X el Sabio and had a deep influence upon stellar toponymy in European languages, in which many names of stars such as Aldebaran still recall their Arabic origin.
Somebody like Ibn al-Haytham, as I said earlier, when they began to notice that there were these fundamental mistakes, and because they respected the Greeks immensely, they were forced to wonder, how did they make these mistakes? That's what led them to the new theorization, to the new astronomical observations, to the new ways of thinking, and to the strategies of observation, to all of it. Those are the crucial developments. So as a result, you have a new way of explaining, a new way of building instruments. So somebody like Ibn al-Haytham of course, not only refutes and rejects the two basic fundamental theories of how does the human eye see, that were inherited from the Greek tradition. He refutes them both and offers the most logical alternative and the best alternative that's backed up by experimentation, backed up by his own work on the science. And as a result, we have what we would call the modern optics that we still understand thanks to Ibn al-Haytham. So these developments, as I say, come because they were critiquing the Greek science as science. And they were critiquing because the Greek science had these major flaws built into it. So I don't think it is a matter of they were trying to pay a debt back to the Greeks. You see, what they were doing, they were busy developing as systematic as they can, as consistent as they can, with their own science, so that they don't fall in the same contradictions that the Greeks fell in.
So someone picks up those links and builds up a better theory.
Yes.
The Arabs and the Muslims wouldn't have a problem with that at that time.
Of course not.
No.
They never hesitated. As a matter of fact, all of this apologia, when you are beginning to wonder as to why were the Greeks making a mistake, you were really esteeming them. You are paying tribute to them in the sense that saying they couldn't have possibly made errors. They were smarter than this. So you are justifying and you are understanding where were the pitfalls, where did they fall in there. And they were not thinking of them as those are aliens and we are a Muslim. No, they were not thinking like that. I don't know this happening.
So this whole idea of apologetics, it's a current creation.
No, I think the way it is used nowadays is to speak of apologias or to speak of people apologizing for their own civilization and attributing to their own civilization things that it did not do. That is the negative term of apologia, and I don't think that they were doing that. They were apologizing to Ptolemy, and when I say somebody like Ibn al-Haytham or any brilliant scientist, they were apologizing to Ptolemy in the sense they were questioning how could a brilliant man make a mistake? Where is the error and where is the source of his error? And that is a critique, really. And that is a process of how science actually works. It actually always says, where did my predecessor make a mistake and how can I improve it? So it is this accumulative process of producing better science at every step.
When the Muslims entered southern Spain, which they called Al-Andalus, barbarians from the north had overrun much of Europe, and the classical civilization of Greece and Rome had gone into eclipse. Islamic Spain then became a bridge by which the scientific, technological and philosophical legacy of the Abbasid period, along with the achievements of Al-Andalus itself, passed into Europe. Between the 7th and 13th centuries, Arab civilization made incredibly large contributions to the future of humankind. These were no less than any other great civilizations before or after. While the West suffered the Dark Ages, Arab culture and learning flourished in a way previously unprecedented. Neither the Greek civilization with its great philosophers nor the Roman civilization with its spectacular conquests and temples exceeded the achievement of the Arabs. Had it not been for the Arab libraries, the centuries of Greek, Roman and Byzantine cultures and learning would have been lost to the Dark Ages. The golden period of Islamic excellence in science, in philosophy, in medical science. This is a time that's looked up by the Muslims with great awe, and what a great time it was. But we are not conversant with that time and the developments that took place, which were taken up in a very positive fashion by the Renaissance makers. However, a so-called classical narrative goes on to postulate that Europe had no need for Arabic scientific material, and that the Islamic scientific tradition was beginning to decline under the onslaught of the works of Ghazali, and thus was no longer deemed important by other cultures. In the grand scheme of things, the European Renaissance was then characterized as a deliberate attempt to bypass the Islamic scientific material and to reconnect directly with the Greco-Roman legacy, where almost all science and all philosophy was supposed to have begun. and where the European Renaissance could find its true wellsprings. What did it feel to be like in the Golden Age?
You feel
in the scientific arena.
Yes, that the feeling that I think which is exhilarating, everybody should be able to appreciate how thrilling it must have been, is that you are constantly, as a scientist, you are constantly challenged by new problems, and you are constantly in competition with the next scientist who is probably going to beat you to the problem.
In Islam, it's very positive to take up things, correct them, and then theory, the basic tenets of making theory.
And that's how they were working at all times. All the way from the 9th century up to the 16th century, this production was constantly going on, and that's what to me constitutes this competitive creativity. That's what a golden age should be really read as a competitive creativity at every stage. I think it is a construction only by Orientalists who were trying to understand how Islamic intellectual history works, and they thought that Islamic intellectual history is really only a product of juridical and religious thought, because they could only see Islam as a religion. They couldn't see it as a civilization. So as a result, they were in a sense justified to say that between the 9th and the 12th century, all the juridical schools were established, like the 4 major Sunni schools and the Ja'fari law. And after that, there was no more new juridical schools to consider. Hence, therefore, there was no more anything to produce, and hence the Golden Age is an earlier period. I say this may be true for the juridical schools, which is really, when one looks at it with a fine comb, you will find that there was a lot of juridical thought happening after the 12th century. But in terms of the science, this model is very bad, because it says that the production in science between the 8th and 9th century and the 10th, 11th century is superior to any other science that was produced. And there I'd say, I take it up in my book, discipline by discipline. I show you that the production that happens after the time of Ghazali is far superior in terms of sophistication, in terms of scientific grasp, much better than what has happened before. So that's why I made the claim, and the disturbing claim, to shift this golden age, especially in planetary theories, to the period after Al-Ghazali. And my intention is not to grab for the golden age and to say it is here or it is there, but to disturb the standard historiography that has caught us into this terminology and force people to think afresh of how science is produced.
The Arabs were the inheritors of the scientific tradition of late antiquity. They applied themselves directly to the original Greek sources and corrected and verified earlier knowledge, elaborated, added, and transformed it dynamically with the help of a socio-economic process. This ensured that they preserved this scientific tradition before passing it on to Europe. What kind of interaction from overseas, let's say, was happening? How the houses of knowledge or universities or these places were like?
They were not academies in the sense that we learned later on of European academies. European academies were completely different concepts. What we did have in the Islamic civilization, apparently, and that I explain it back again, with the new bureaucracy that Abdul Malik ibn Marwan brought into being, the only job in government and the only chance of your improvement was to get better than those that are employed in government. So as a result,
this is the year,
you will find, well, he died in 705 AD.
Okay.
But once you start this mechanism, you can't stop it. The acquisition of knowledge, once it begins to go, it is just like a flood. You simply cannot arrest it. What happened is that it is this bureaucracy that actually begins to maintain those sources of knowledge through their own private libraries, through their own collection that were later on known as houses of wisdom, houses of science, and the like. And it was those bureaucrats that began to actually almost monopolize this production of new knowledge to be able to compete for jobs at the court, to be able to say, hire me as a vizier or not. What evidence do I have for that? I have a treatise written by Hunayn ibn Ishaq about the books that he translated from Greek into Arabic. He lists 129 books of Galen that he translated. Not a single one of those books was translated for a caliph. They were all translated for bureaucrats in the government.
Using accounts of early Islamic scholars to show the essential roles of government bureaucracies, George Saliba argues that the foundations of Islamic scientific thought were laid well before early Persian and Greek sources for the use of government departments translated into Arabic in the 9th century, as suggested by the 10th century science historian Ibn al-Nadim, who is usually ignored by modern scholars.
Now, why would the bureaucrats pay for translations if they were not thinking that by arming themselves with better knowledge, they would get a higher position in government? And how do we explain this and corroborate it? We know of 100 years of Bakhtishurs, physicians at the court, father passing on the position to his son, to their grandsons, and so on.
The Academy of Jundishapur was founded in the middle of the 5th century AD by the Sassanid dynasty. The Jundishapur complex consisted of a university, a library, and a teaching hospital. By the orders of the Sassanid king Khusro Anishirawan, an institution was established to methodically care for the sick and ill while simultaneously training the students of medicine at the school by hiring physicians and scholars from Greece and India. It was here that every known book on medicine was gathered, translated, and compiled, making Jundishapur a key center of transmission of ancient medical knowledge to the New World. During the early days of Islam, the medical school and hospital at Jundishapur was a focal point of science, particularly medicine. It housed Iranian, Indian, Roman, and Greek physicians active in both theoretical and clinical aspects. It is even said that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had a personal physician who was a graduate of Jundishapur. The famous House of Wisdom or Baitul Hikmah under the Caliphate of Harun al-Rashid is also thought to have been modelled on Jundishapur and thus became its immediate successor.
We know the Bani Nawbakht, astrologers at the court for another 100 years. Those bureaucrats, the caliphs come and go, but they stay. So the only stability of knowledge, of acquisition of knowledge, production of knowledge, remains at the bureaucratic level. And this, to me, explains the dynamics of the movement of Islamic science much, much better than saying that it is the caliph who dreamt and saw Aristotle in his dream and required him to translate this or that. That was nonsense that comes with the classical theory of how Greek science passed on to Arabic.
But most importantly, the classical narrative leaves us with yet more serious and inexplicable problems, both with regard to the beginnings of Islamic science, decline, and eventual demise. In the case of beginnings, the classical narrative creates the impression that the birth of Islamic science took place during the early period of the Abbasid times, mainly during the latter part of the 8th century and the early part of the 9th, as a result of one or more of processes of transformation such as extensive contact with or translations of earlier Greek and Sanskrit texts into Arabic taking place. Nevertheless, as we have tried to explain, it is not the whole truth. During the end of the first millennium, Cordova was the intellectual well from which European seekers of knowledge came to drink. Students from France and England traveled there to sit at the feet of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars to learn philosophy, science, and medicine. According to a historian, the great library of Cordova alone contained some 600,000 manuscripts. At a time when London was a tiny mud hut village that could not boast of a single street lamp, there were 500,000 inhabitants in Cordova, living in 113,000 houses. There were 700 mosques and 300 public baths spread throughout the city and its 21 suburbs. According to Burke, the streets were paved and lit. The houses had marble balconies for summer and hot air ducts under the mosaic floors for the winter. They were adorned with gardens with artificial fountains and orchards. According to another historian, paper, a material still unknown to the West, was everywhere. There were bookshops and more than 70 libraries. This rich and sophisticated society took a tolerant view towards other faiths. Tolerance was unheard of in the rest of Europe. But in Moorish Spain, according to the historian Burke, thousands of Jews and Christians lived in peace and harmony with their Muslim overlords. The society had a literary rather than a religious base, and economically their prosperity was unparalleled for centuries.